Look, I get it. These days I look in the mirror and I have to admit, I'm not the strapping young Muslim socialist that I used to be. Time passes, get a little gray, and yet, even after all this time, I still make rookie mistakes. Like, I'm out in California, we're at a fundraiser, we're having a nice time. I happen to mention that Kamala Harris is the best-looking Attorney General in the country. As you might imagine, I got trouble when I got back home. Who knew Eric Holder was so sensitive?
This evening, I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. Despite these holocausts, America is today the strongest, the most influential, and most productive nation in the world. Understandably proud of this preeminence, we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interest of world peace and human betterment. Throughout America's adventure in free government, our basic purposes have been to keep the peace, to foster progress in human achievement, and to enhance liberty, dignity, and integrity among peoples and among nations. To strive for less would be unworthy of a free and religious people. Any failure traceable to arrogance or our lack of comprehension or readiness to sacrifice would inflict upon us grievous hurt, both at home and abroad. Progress toward these noble goals is persistently threatened by the conflict now engulfing the world. It commands our whole attention, absorbs our very beings. We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. Unhappily, the danger it poses promises to be of indefinite duration. To meet it successfully, there is call for not so much the emotional and transitory sacrifices of crisis, but rather those which enable us to carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint, the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle with liberty, the stake. But threats, new in kind or degree, constantly arise. Of these I mention 2 only. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizen can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
It was on its face disturbing, even shocking news. 2 military officials in charge of the nation's nuclear arsenal sacked within days of each other. Major General Michael Carey, the 2-star general responsible for the Air Force's land-based nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles, fired after misbehavior on a business trip involving alcohol, a source tells CNN. And in a separate case, Vice Admiral Tim Giardina was formally relieved from his duties as the second in command of U.S. nuclear forces, amid allegations involving counterfeit gambling chips.
There can be no tolerance at all for the world of handling and employing nuclear weapon systems. The readiness has to be at the very highest levels. You have to select only the very, very best.
These are just the latest in a recent rash of firings in the military's top ranks. Last month, 2 Marine generals were removed for failing to protect their troops from a Taliban attack in Afghanistan that killed 2 Marines. The string of firings of top-level officials comes as the military's leadership is trying to send a message through the ranks about zero tolerance of bad behavior.
The overall notion of accountability remains in place. And that's the key message you have to send to your forces all the time, which is we're gonna evaluate what you do, we're watching what you do, we need you to do your job.
The military has been here before. Last fall, then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta ordered Joint Chiefs Chairman Martin Dempsey to review ethics standards for senior officers after several incidents of reported improper behavior among the top brass.
Now's the time for us to recommit ourselves to our profession. Now's the time for character to be valued as much, if not more, than competence. Now's the time for moral courage at every level. There can be no bystanders.
In the case of the nuclear commander fired on Friday, officials tell CNN that his behavior did not impact highly sensitive nuclear weapons operations.
The Air Force officers were from the Global Strike Command at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. The Air Force says some of them cheated on a proficiency test last August and September. Other officers apparently knew about the cheating but didn't stop it or report it. All 34 have been decertified and restricted from missile crew duty. The cheating involved text messages shared during the exams. Here's some of what the Air Force Secretary Deborah Lee James told reporters earlier today.
This is absolutely unacceptable behavior, and it is completely contrary to our core values in the Air Force. And as everybody here knows, the #1 core value for us is integrity.
And so this is just the latest in a series of scandals involving those watching U.S. nuclear arms. It's pretty well documented. An Air Force major with the service was fired because he was said to have drank too much and gotten into trouble in Russia. There's an ongoing investigation into illegal drug possession involving Air Force personnel, which may have actually opened the door to this cheating probe in the first place. There's also the case of a Navy vice admiral overseeing nuclear weapons who was removed from command after being implicated in a gambling investigation. Not an excuse, but studies suggest manning the missiles can be a very lonely, isolated job. DoD personnel who deal with the nuclear arsenal can have a litany of problems, including burnout, wolf, domestic violence, even napping on the job has become an issue. The Secretary of Defense himself actually went out to the base in Montana earlier this month just to highlight some of those problems.
And to their credit, Joe, we're learning about all of this from the Department of Defense and the U.S. Air Force. They're not trying to conceal it. This wasn't revealed as a result of great reporting or anything. They told us about this.
I think it's very notable the level of disclosure you're getting from the Department of Defense, which we know in some other cases might not have occurred, but they're certainly putting it out there for people to talk about.
A scandal inside the Air Force's Nuclear Weapons Command is widening this morning. Nearly 36 officers at an Air Force base in Montana are removed from duty. Officials claim they cheated on a test. Air Force Secretary Deborah Lee James says she is profoundly disappointed. David Martin is at the Pentagon. David, good morning.
Good morning, Charlie and Nora. This appears to be the biggest cheating scandal ever to hit the nuclear missile force, and it was uncovered in the course of a drug investigation into the possession of recreational drugs by missile launch officers. 34 launch officers at Montana's Malmstrom Air Force Base were involved in sharing answers to a monthly proficiency test.
Now, let me state this a different way. There was cheating that took place with respect to this particular test.
According to top Air Force officials, a launch officer at Malmstrom last September allegedly texted the answers to other officers at the base.
We've decertified all 34 officers involved. They are restricted for missile crew duty. Their security clearances have been suspended.
There's no indication the cheating went beyond Malmstrom to the other missile bases at Minot, North Dakota, and F.E. Warren, Wyoming, where Defense Secretary Hagel spoke to airmen just last week.
In what you do every day, there is no room for error, none. You know that.
Launch officers also perform monthly drills simulating emergency warp procedures. So cheating on a written test does not necessarily mean they don't know their duties.
It's hard to cover up incompetence cheating one time on a test when you're going to have a monthly simulator with 2 instructors watching you actually conduct the practical application of this knowledge in a simulator. You can't hide that.
There are 600 missile launch officers in the Air Force, and by the end of today, all of them will have retaken that compromised test. Meanwhile, that drug investigation has implicated 3 launch control officers along with 8 other Air Force officers.
All right, David at the Pentagon, thank you.
Well, excerpts from former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates' new memoir paint a picture of a president who does not trust his own military. One in particular says, quote, all too early in the Obama administration, suspicion and distrust of senior military officers by senior White House officials, including the president and vice president, became a big problem for me as I tried to manage the relationship between the commander-in-chief and his military leaders.
Well, according to our next guest, Gates wasn't the only official to witness this. Joining us now is retired Navy Commander J.D. Gordon. He served as Defense Department spokesperson during the first 9 months of the Obama administration. Good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Anna. Good morning, Tucker.
Hey, J.D.
First, you say you noticed a switch between the mood that staffers noticed between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Can you detail that for us?
Yes, absolutely. I think everybody at the Pentagon realized the tremendous attitude shift from the White House. President Obama came in talking about closing Guantanamo, and not just closing it, he said it was shameful. And really, he didn't know anything about Guantanamo. I had been to Guantanamo over 30 times in 4 years as the Pentagon spokesman for the Western Hemisphere. President Obama repeated a lot of things about the detention facility that just weren't true. So I think a lot of people in the military realized that, A, he didn't know what he was talking about, and B, that he was blaming people that he shouldn't blame. And also, he talked a lot about repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. According to Secretary Gates in the book, that was the only thing that President Obama really became animated about, was repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which also rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And also these tremendous budget cuts. Right now, we're in the midst of $1 trillion in budget cuts to the Defense Department, and that's going to hollow us out like during the 1970s.
Don't ask, don't tell. Like, what does that have to do with defending the country? So, J.D., you note something that almost nobody remembers or noticed, the purge of senior military officers by the Obama administration. Tell us about that.
Right, yes. I was in the studio on Fox and Friends about a month ago talking about the purge of senior military officers. There have been about 200 senior military officers fired under President Obama. That's the most in any recent presidential administration, and we're talking about 4-star admirals and generals, colonels, captains. Basically, if there's any whiff of controversy, President Obama basically just wants to get rid of people. No second question asked, just fire them. And it's really terrible because it's also weakening the military, this purge of senior military officers.
And what do you think about the unilateral nature of the Obama administration really often being accused of not listening to military counsel?
Yeah, I don't think that President Obama likes to listen to admirals and generals. I think he knows it all, essentially. He's never lost an election. He's been very successful at everything he's ever done. So I think he distrusts the military. He trusts his own judgment. And I think that comes through in the Gates book. I also think it's important to note that in Secretary Gates' book, you can see how politically calculated President Obama is and Secretary Clinton is. Basically, they put politics above national security for their decision to oppose the surge in Iraq in 2007. I think that's really important for Americans to know, especially as we move towards 2016.
It's so striking to hear you say that Obama was willing to fire senior military brass for basically nothing when he's been so reluctant to fire any of his political staff for example, screwing up Obamacare so profoundly. Were these people fired because they were failing to protect America, or were they fired for reasons other than that?
Most of it was either personal misconduct or allegations against them. One guy got fired for counterfeit poker chips. But at the same time, he has this all-out assault on senior military officers. He's letting as many al-Qaeda guys go from Guantanamo as humanly possible. He just let 11 go within the last few months. Under the terms of the National Defense Authorization Act, about half the 155 there now are going to be released. I'm going to a march today, actually, in Washington. There's a march on the White House from this anti-Gitmo coalition that's made up of groups like Amnesty International and Reprieve, Center for Constitutional Rights. Believe it or not, these groups are linked to al-Qaeda financiers, communists, and anarchist groups. Yet these are the very people that President Obama is trying to support in closing Guantanamo. These are the people that he's trying to have their back. It's really shocking. If only more Americans knew about it, they'd be outraged.
All right, thank you. Former DOD spokesperson and retired Navy Commander J.D. Gordon, we thank you for your time today.